Welcome everybody. It's nice to see you all here, and obviously to anybody who's watching this later through the recording. I hope you get some benefit from it. So this is a webinar that's been prepared on behalf of the Charity Collaboration Network. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. And we're giving it the title, Act Today to Create a Better Tomorrow. And really, in the end, it's all about your fundraising and how you might want to approach your fundraising. We've got a few things we're going to focus into in a bit more detail. Now, there's two of us presenting today. I'm Andrew Heaward. I'm the Managing Director of Heaward Solutions. And my colleague is Richard Morris. Richard, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Richard Morris. I'm co-founder of a charity called The Giving Machine, which provides free fundraising tools for lots of different good causes. And I'm also a leadership consultant because my background was starting and scaling businesses here in the UK and US.
Thank you, Richard. Richard also knows an awful lot about digital, which we'll learn more about, I'm sure, as we go through.
Well, I can spell it. So we're going to try and make sure this is a bit of a sort of double act. I guess I was going to introduce myself as a sort of I don't know, the better looking half of the two of us, but that's not true. So in terms of the CCN, because obviously that's something that has relatively recently formed, Andrew, tell us a little bit more about what on earth the CCN is as a sort of a backdrop to why we're doing this. No problem at all.
So about 18 months or so ago, some of you will be aware, the Small Charities Coalition had kind of folded, which is a real shame. You know, it left a real gap in the sort of charitable not-for-profit sector in terms of support and advice and bringing together of smaller charitable organisations, of which there are hundreds of thousands, absolutely enormous. So CCN is a group on LinkedIn. It's not wildly formal. It's not intended to be. There are a number of us who've got together to bring this, co-found this group. And really what it's trying to do, it's trying to provide a free platform to bring not-for-profit organisations together to talk, to learn from each other, and really to help those smaller organisations, you know, that could be schools, social enterprises, sports clubs, charities, you know, do the things you need to flourish. Because, you know, it's great working with a consultant like me or bringing advice in from a specialist like Richard, but actually, as well as that, it's really good to share between yourselves because there's a huge amount of learning there in the sector already. So that's the purpose of CCN. If you're not involved, you'll see right the way through these slides, there's the pink band on the right-hand side. That's everything you need to find the group on LinkedIn. Please check it out, join, it's free to join. There's no obligations of any kind, just get some value from it. So that's what CCN.
And I think just to back up what you've just said there, Andrew, I think it's really important that even though it's called the Charity Collaboration Network, charity is meant in the term of the sort of giving back sort of philosophy of all the different types of organisations. It's not just registered charities. And I think the other thing that I'd ask, if you learn something that's worth sharing, please put it onto the network because we are so much stronger together. It's hard enough to run any form of business, and certainly in the sort of sector that we're in, if we collaborate more, we just make our lives a lot easier and we can have more impact together.
Absolutely. Richard, just move me on to the next slide, if that's okay. Richard's running the slides this morning, so
yeah, so that's right. I'm Tinkerbell. I get to, if you just go ding, I'll do all that. So talk us through the agenda, Andrew.
Yeah, no problem. So we've got kind of 11 things we want to talk to you about this morning. So we're going to talk a little bit about accessing funding, about legal structures, things like that. We're going to talk a bit about what we're actually selling when we're fundraising, and that's a really important sort of starting point. Then we're going to get into the whole conversation around diversification and risk. You know, what do those two things mean in a fundraising context? Then we're going to say, how do you avoid those horrible car crashes of like lots of failures? What are those obvious mistakes that we can try and avoid in our fundraising? Then we're going to talk a little about investing in your fundraising. It's a really interesting question as a consultant. I'm asked all the time about, you know, how much should I be investing? You know, how does this work? So we can talk a bit about that. We're going to talk about the importance of building an audience, and I would call that foundational. So we'll really get into that in quite a lot of detail. Then following on from that, we'll talk about marketing funnels and how they relate to this process of building your audience. Then we're going to talk about, you know, why is digital so important today? We're going to talk a little bit about primary and secondary trading and trading more generally. That's particularly relevant to the charities in the room. And then we're going to say, how can you get some more help, and give you a chance to ask us any questions that you might have.
Excellent. So it's a fun-packed agenda.
Very much. Lots going on this morning.
Right. So shall we move on to the first question?
Please, Richard.
So, of course, one of the biggest questions for any organisation is, okay, what funds are out there? How do I access them? So talk us through this slide, Andrew.
Yeah, no problem at all. So one of the things I spend a lot of my life doing is fundraising research, particularly around grants, but it applies to other things as well, actually, to some degree. And this model that you see in front of you is something we developed a while ago. And effectively, it just sets out the reality of access, particularly to grant funding, but actually there's a measure of truth beyond that, depending on your legal status. So at the very bottom, if you are a for-profit business, your access to funding is going to be very, very limited. It's going to be the money you can earn as a business. It's going to be like trading. And actually, your only grants you're going to get are going to be the odd grant for job creation and things like that. Then you get into unincorporated groups. Now, what are unincorporated groups? They tend to be things like your pub football team. These are small-scale community organisations, and they've got some access to grants and some access to fundraising. The problem you get for a lot of organisations is they don't have a legal status. Actually, the individuals make up the organisation. As a result, funders can't contract with them, and that makes it quite difficult. Unregistered charities, that's a charity with a turnover of less than £5,000. Above £5,000, you're legally required to register. So that's a very small charity. They have the same problem. They're unincorporated. So actually, again, it's difficult for organisations to have a relationship with them. Then you get into the kind of structured legal personalities, social enterprise. Social enterprise is a very difficult term, yeah, but actually really interesting organisations. Social enterprise is a catch-all term. You'll hear it thrown around. It's actually fairly meaningless in some ways because it has no legal meaning. What it really means is an organisation that operates in a kind of semi-trading model. Yeah. Now, the most common of those is the community interest company in the UK, but there are others: industrial and providence societies, co-ops. Some charities work as social enterprises. So, that's the problem with the term. But the most common is the CIC, and effectively, the way a CIC works, you can think of it as a hybrid between a charity and a business. It sits in the middle ground. It trades as much as it generates money from traditional fundraising. CICs, I really like CICs. They solve some of the sustainability problems that we perhaps have more in the charitable world, because they have that ability to generate money from trading activity in a way that's much more difficult for charities. Not impossible, but more challenging. There are some lovely examples of social enterprises. So, for example, some of you will be well aware of the Youth Hostel Association. They are a charity. They're also a massive UK social enterprise. Yeah, so this is where this gets so complicated. Then we have the top two, a charitable incorporated organisation and a registered charity. Really, they're very, very similar. Registered charities, the traditional model, what the charities we've had in the UK ever since charities first came along. Charitable incorporated organisations are a modern version of that. They're simpler to register-ish. And the big difference between the two is that a registered charity is incorporated as a company first, and then registers as a charity, whereas a charitable incorporated organisation registers as a charity and becomes an entity all in one go, yeah, but doesn't have the same limited liabilities of a registered charity. So there's pros and cons there, but from a fundraising perspective, that triangle that you can see, the coins, show it really well. The more charitable you are, the more your access to funding becomes. In a simple way, when I do a funding search for an organisation, I can tell you that a registered charity will see 100% of the opportunities available. A social enterprise will typically see, particularly CIC, perhaps 40 to 60%, and an unregistered organisation maybe 20 to 30% of the opportunities. So the more charitable you are, the better your grant funding opportunities are, but also the better people understand you, which means the better your other fundraising opportunities are. A CIC can ask for individual giving just like a charity. The problem is that actually people rub their chins and say, "What's a CIC?" Whereas if they see the word charity, you know immediately what it is. And I would generally suggest that CIOs, charitable incorporated organisations, describe themselves as charities because they are registered charities, and it just takes that confusion away. So that's.
And on the subject of social enterprise, I know in my own experience with the Giving Machine, we started off being a social enterprise. But interestingly enough, before CICs have become a thing, we put all of the relevant text that we needed in our sort of legal documents, but still weren't recognized because, and you put example of CIC, I think for a lot of funders, they see social enterprises and CICs as the same thing. And as you pointed out, they're not necessarily one for one, but I think if you're thinking about funding, you've got to understand what kind of tick boxes funders typically are looking for. And CIC registration is one of those tick boxes as a structure.
Yeah, absolutely. From a funder's perspective, they understand CICs. I did some work with a Industrial and Providence Society last year, and that was very difficult because lots of funders just did, they're so uncommon that they just didn't get it.
Yeah,
and that's a problem.
And it's too much work. Yeah, so I just was, because once you get above that, it's very clear what you are, and that's, I think. Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Andrew.
Should we move on, Richard?
Yes, let's do that.
Okay, so I've got a question for Richard actually here. So Richard, tell us a bit about what we're actually selling.
Well, it's funny because one of the things that I've thought about a lot over the years is because I've worked in the sort of, I suppose, the more for-profit sector as well as the sort of non-profit sector. Usually when people part with money, they're buying something. So what are they actually buying? And I think one of the things that's quite interesting is when you look at a lot of the sort of larger scale charitable fundraising initiatives, sadly, they often work on guilt. So and the reason I say sad is because the mechanic goes something like this. I'm going to tell you about something that is really a thorny topic in this world, right? And there's plenty of them. We know that. I'm going to show you images. I'm going to make you feel guilty because you've got a life that perhaps doesn't have that. So for X pounds a month, I'm going to ask you to kind of do something about that guilt, but I won't take it totally away. And it's a very effective form of fundraising because it works. But one of the things it does do is it leaves a bit of a bitter taste. And the example could be chugging in the street where you actually see people and you think, actually, I don't want to engage with them. You cross over to the other side. You see certain things on the telly and think, I'm going to switch off. Because ultimately, it's about you start protecting yourself. Or it's the bit, you know, you're buying a card for somebody and do you want to buy this crap pen for £1 or something like that? And I don't think it's a very humane way of fundraising. So when we actually look separately at some of the happiest individuals on the planet, and typically often they're sort of focused in the Scandinavian areas, but we all can subscribe to that. One of the key attributes of some of the most happy people on the planet are the fact some form of altruism, some form of I want to make a difference. And so what I would propose is that really we're in the business of selling happiness. And let me explain why. Because most people want to make a difference. They want to make a positive difference, but they can't do it on their own. So when they learn about a particular non-profit charitable activity, even if you look at, say, primary schools with their parents, people want a difference. Now, of course, with primary schools, there's a vested interest because your kids are going there. But fundamentally, it's to make a difference. So you kind of get involved because you'll give people your time, you'll give people your money because you think, do you know what, I'd like to make a difference there. And therefore, the feedback loop then is to say, great, come and join us to make this difference. And it could be, you know, you're dealing with and I use the word thorny topic, but something that isn't particularly pleasant, but actually the fact that you're addressing it and making a difference is really important. And when you feed back to the donor or the supporter, because it isn't just about money, it might be about their time, the fact that we've made a difference together, not just we've made a difference with your money, together we've made a difference. That creates a happiness equation. So I would argue very much when in the sort of fundraising space, what we're selling is happiness. People want to make a difference. And what we need to do is persuade them to say, look, this is the difference we're making. Come and join us because we can do more of this together. It's a much higher energy level transaction. It's more likely for people to say, do you know what, I really enjoy making a difference over here, and inviting their friends, family to be part of this, rather than the sort of guilt one, which tends to be, when was the last time you had a sort of guilt-based response and you went to someone else and said, do you know what, I really enjoyed that, would you like to join me? It just isn't going to happen. And I think some of that guilt-based fundraising tends to pollute the water for the rest of us. Whereas I think all of us, make a difference in the way we make a difference, and we should tell that as a positive story and feed that back to people to make them feel, do you know what? Yeah, the world can be a bit of a crappy place, but actually together we make it different, we make it better, and we continue to do so. And I think that to me is really what we're selling.
Thank you, Richard. You know, I absolutely love that phrase, the happiness equation. Really interesting way of thinking about it. Right,
so
brilliant.
Yeah, so that's me off my soapbox now, but it just sets the tone for how to invite people in.
Absolutely.
So
right.
So then bringing it back down to earth, let's talk a little bit about diversification risk and how they're actually related.
Yeah, no problem at all. Right, let me just move on. Okay then, so this is a really important topic actually, because the two are intimately related. There really are, there's two different kinds of diversification I think we need to think about within the not-for-profit sector particularly. I mean, there's probably more, but these are the two that strike me as particularly fundamental. You've got diversification within your fundraising, which is something that I will absolutely talk about in a moment. And then you've also got something in terms of diversification within your organisation, particularly at board level, but actually it applies through any organisation. And this is the more traditional ideas of diversification. You know, we're talking about gender, we're talking about ethnicity, we're talking about diversification of skills and knowledge, you know, the benefits that come from having these different viewpoints. And taking on that perhaps another level further, perhaps we should be thinking more about diversification of thinking and approach and skills. So, you know, where's the role here for, you know, neurodiverse ways of thinking? Where's the role here for making sure we've got a balance between entrepreneurial mindsets in our boards and in our organizations and more conservative people? Because actually that has a huge impact on risk appetite, and risk is a very important part of running any organization. Richard, I'm sure, will tell us that, you know, doesn't matter what you're doing in a business, you know, ultimately managing risk is at the heart of, you know, being successful or not. You can't move forward without a bit of risk. And I don't think it's any different in the charitable sector. I really, really don't. It's just an organization thing. So that's the board bit. Let's talk more fundamentally, I guess, in terms of today's conversation around fundraising diversification. And this is a topic when I work on strategy that I talk to people an awful lot about, because I think it really, really matters. So what do we mean by diversification? Well, there's lots of different ways that might mean in your fundraising. It could be the source of your fundraising. So, you know, we'll talk about the different strategies in a moment that are open to you. It might be, are we looking at fundraising activity that has a short or a long-term reward? And what's the balance between those two things in our strategy? You know, legacy is hugely different to individual giving in terms of when you'll get some benefit from it, for example. Yeah. We might want to think about the diversification between restricted and unrestricted funding. We'd all love lots of unrestricted funding. It's the golden goose every organisation wants. I can tell you by a country mile, it is by far the hardest to lay your hands on. You know, so actually, where does that balance sit? What works for our organisation? And we need to have a blend of the two things. We need to think about different kinds of funding, particularly when we talk about grants. You know, what do we need for core funding versus what do we need for project funding? Or actually, is there a place for capital fundraising in our organisation? And how do those things blend together to get us the success we want? So thinking about that. And then the other kind of final part of that picture is your profile of your income. Actually, do you want this week by week, year by year, gradual kind of income pattern? Every organisation will kind of love that predictability, but how the reality is that it's probably not going to be the case, and it's going to be much more lumpy. So actually, how do we plan for that and understand that's part of our strategy? Now, there's lots of things to think here. You know, we need to think about the types of fundraising. I'm going to come on to that in a minute. We need to think, is it big or small funding that we're after? Now, a lot of the time as a consultant, I get people come to us and say, can you find us a big multi-year grant, Andrew? Well, possibly, maybe, but that's going to be challenging, because the bigger they ask, the tougher the challenge. You know, it's like the bigger the mountain you want to climb, the harder it's going to be. Going up Everest is going to be much harder than going up one of the 3 peaks, for example. So actually scale has an impact at that level. But also, the other thing I'd say here, this is a statistic that people, you know, perhaps aren't always aware, is roughly the 300 biggest trusts and foundations in this country account for about 60% of total giving. So what does that tell us with 8,000 odd trusts and foundations? Well, it tells us that there's a huge number giving out very modest awards. So should we be ignoring those very modest awards? And my advice would always be no. I get the challenge of trying to satisfy 20, 30 funders at one time. That's a nightmare. But equally, if you only chase the big, chunky, lumpy amounts of money, then your success rate's going to be lower, and you're going to find that you're missing opportunities, and yet your total income will probably be lower. So balancing, diversifying between big and small funds, a really important part of your thinking here. Then thinking about how you approach this. Is it an obvious fit, or are there other kinds of fundraising? So when we do funding research, we think about it in these terms. We think about kind of green, amber, and red. A green fund is a blindingly obvious fund. It's one that, is just a perfect obvious fit for that organization. A red fund isn't a bad fund. It's just something that's popped up in our research that's a bit out there. It's a bit challenging. It takes them in a new direction. It isn't what they asked us for, but might be really good. And then the amber, these are the ones I get really excited about. Amber are what I would call lateral thinking funders. I'll give you a quick example, one I use all the time, and that's that about 2 years ago or so, the government, the Co-op, had an absolutely enormous programme of funding available for addressing loneliness and isolation of older people. Now, had you been a bowls club at the time looking for funding, you'd done your funding search based on sport or bowls, or if you've been a bit above average, you might have used a keyword like physical activity. The reality is you've never found that grant programme in a million years with those keywords. But what's a bowls club if it isn't a brilliant structure bringing older people together socially? So those amber, those lateral thinking opportunities are ones where actually you can deliver a funder's outcomes, aims and objectives and your own, despite the fact they're actually often very different.
Actually, on that point, Andrew, I was going to just chip in is, I know when I've been in a couple of seminars and met some of the sort of more amateur sports clubs and sports groups, one of the things that they often get fixated on is their particular sport. And one of the things that's really important is say, but come above that. You're creating a place for either young people or elderly people, or somewhere for people to belong, contribute and thrive. Sport is the vehicle, but the reason you've got to come up, which then gives you access to some of the things you're talking about, but gives you a much clearer why, and you can attract people in to help you that aren't particularly cricket fans or bowls fans or football fans, because it isn't really about the sport. It's actually about creating that place for people to belong, to contribute and to somehow thrive in that community, which then I suppose relates to what kind of grants or funders might be interested in what you do.
Absolutely, Richard. It's something I talk to people an awful lot about, this idea of the service you're providing being a vehicle, and there's lots of ways of carving it up. It's about the service you provide and what that opportunities that leads you to, but it's also about who it is you're working with and what opportunities that leads you to, where you are and what opportunities that leads you to, and so on. So if you start thinking a little bit more laterally, you're opening up way more opportunities, and by opening doors, you're increasing your chance of being successful. That's a really important piece of thinking.
And from your diversification, if I was using an analogy, even if we don't like necessarily all of us like fishing, but the point is you've got to fish for the big fish, but you've also got to make sure that you get the sort of regular pieces as well, so that, as I say, you sort of diversify on the size of the catch, as it were, because obviously the bigger ones come fewer and far between, if you like.
Absolutely, and then there's an important point that kind of comes off the back of that. So someone's coming in, there we go, let them in. What I'd say there is that it's really important to think about those big fish, those big grants that you get come in, and think about how that affects your fundraising in the terms of kind of, if you get a big grant in, it's wonderful, but I've seen it become a real problem for organizations quite regularly, because what happens is you get this huge grant, you get a peak in your income and everything grows and you're doing wonderful, but actually it's very difficult to sustain that. And so in what you have to be doing is not getting a big grant, living off it for 3 years, and then in the last 3 months thinking, oh my God, where do we go next?
Yeah,
because that happens a lot. It happens an awful lot, and it's understandable because you're focused on the delivery of the service. The problem is actually then not giving yourself time to solve the problem of, how do we go further? And that's really the moment when that diversification and that thinking about risk the moment you get that big award, that's when you should be thinking about it.
Sure.
Because it gives you the time, the space to begin to solve that problem and to plan for the future. Because you need to be planning for what happens at the end of that grant. Because all too often that funder isn't going to repeat fund you year after year after year after year, because they want to spread the love as well. Right, Richard, should we move on?
Yep, sure. So
Okay.
obviously, the landscape of fundraising strategies is massive. So I know you've sort of helped with a little bit of color coding. So so as your sort of I know your better looking assistant, if you like, talk us through the sort of color coding and how you've helped make sense of this.
So this is a fairly simple slide, and I've done a quick brainstorming exercise. I said, what kinds of fundraising techniques and approaches are out there, and actually how are they different? Yeah, and I've kind of categorized them from restricted funding to unrestricted funding. Obviously, unrestricted funding, you can do whatever you like with it. Restricted funding, you're usually contractually obliged to doing what you said in an application of some form, that you or an agreement. Yeah, so it's really quite interesting, and that these invariably, I think this looks to be clear cut. It's not perhaps in reality quite as clear cut as it first appears. But at the top two, these two white categories, these are your public sources of funding, public grants, public commissioning. Really exciting funding, often very chunky, really nice to get, quite challenging. The problem with them is they can also disappear from you overnight. I've unfortunately, I had a long career in the public sector, and many times I saw the public purse struggling and money just disappeared from underneath the organisations literally overnight. All of a sudden a politician makes a decision, actually we need to make a saving. Oh, okay, we'll cut from the voluntary community services budget. Or we'll cut something from the support we provide people with disabilities. And that tends not to be provided by themselves, but commissioned or granted through community organisations. So like that, those are challenging funds, but should be part of your mix. And when we think about, go back to diversification and risk, worth having in your plans because they're value, but remember the risk level that goes with them.
And in fact, in my experiences, I was a trustee of YMCA, not the main YMCA, but one of the sort of regional YMCAs, and that commissioning side of things, as things started to, I suppose, cut costs, and actually they wanted to commission much larger groups. That then created a whole sort of consolidation in the sort of YMCA network. So it has, I can see the fact that you're part of a supply chain, and in fact the commissioning changes in structures changed the whole supply chain and the organisations within it.
The other thing you see in that commissioning and public grant space, you often see perhaps the funding remaining the same, but the expectation in terms of service delivery going through the roof.
Yes, and in fact, tracking and monitoring, I saw that as to prove the fact that your delivering goes up as well. Yeah, absolutely.
So coming down a tier from then, in terms of still restricted funding, but perhaps slightly less risky. We've got national lottery, trusts and foundations, social investment. And lots of people don't think about social investment, but actually really exciting form of fundraising, effectively loans for the not-for-profit sector, but for the right projects, far less competitive. So really quite an interesting way of resourcing things if you have the right project. And then crowdfunding. Crowdfunding is an interesting one. Oh, someone else is arriving. Let's just let them back in. Crowdfunding, effectively, it sits on that boundary almost between restricted and unrestricted, in the sense that you're usually going out with a campaign that says, we want to do this, please support us and help us. But actually what you're not getting is that level of contractual obligation between you and your supporter. Yeah, so you've got a kind of moral obligation at this point to use it the way you described. So crowdfunding, another interesting one, and we'll talk a bit more about crowdfunding, I suspect, as we go through. Then moving down a bit further, we get into other interesting ideas. Immemorial funding. This is your effectively the classic example. That is your brass plate on a park bench, your memory walls or memory trees that we've seen before. Lovely forms of fundraising, actually. High net worth giving, again, that's on that boundary, isn't it? Because you're into a conversation with your big donor who says, actually, this is what I want my money to go for. And if you don't do what you've agreed, then you're going to have a relationship problem, and that's going to lead to probably not securing that donation in the future from that individual. So very much into that same space. Legacies, this is your donations in someone's will. this is really exciting form of fundraising, but very long term. So, problematic at that level. But when we talk about balance, we talked earlier on, I think quite an interesting element. CSR, I think, after you've got CSR and sponsorship there in the orange, people see those two things as the same thing, and they're just not. Yeah. The reality is CSR is something a business does out of goodwill. They're not really looking for a huge amount of return from it. It's usually about how can we be seen to be being a socially responsible organisation, to be putting back into our community. And very frequently, CSR isn't about cash. It's about use of services, or it's about staff helping out, giving staff some time out to volunteer, things like that. So CSR is less about cash support, but still very, very valuable quite often. But whereas sponsorship is a commercial transaction. Whilst the sponsor doesn't really care how you use their money, what they care about is getting what you promised them. So actually it's PR, it's exposure, it's access to a new market, it's all that sort of thing. So it's a much more hard-edged commercial conversation. Whereas your corporate giving, that's just, your charity of the year. We're going to raise some money. It's part of our CSR strategy, but actually we're going to give you some cash. So this is your kind of corporate things. And then we've got events just above those. And there's two, I always think about events in two ways. You've got event promotion. These are the events you run yourself. A lot of work potentially running a charity ball, running a half marathon event, whatever it looks like. These are, and they can be from big to small. It could be as small as a jumble sale, for a very small organization. But these take a lot of work, a lot of volunteer time. But you have complete control over them, and the income is typically completely unrestricted. Event representation, slightly different. This is where someone says, I'm going to participate in a marathon for you. And I've seen charities do this really successfully. They have programs, that will actually recruit people to represent them in a whole load of different events. And, they'll have fundraising targets and all the rest. You typically see London marathon places, raise £1,000 for us and we'll give you a place in the marathon, that sort of thing. But, that works from big national programs down to very small things very successfully. But you can really build something quite exciting out. Digital fundraising, there's all sorts of stuff around digital. I'll ask Richard to give us a bit more information about that perhaps in a moment. And then we've got community fundraising. This is your jumble sales, it's your raffles, it's all the stuff at the very local level, and works really well where you can mobilise local people as your advocates for it. I think that's the power on that one. It's that kind of use of volunteers can be really exciting there. Individual giving, we're all pretty aware of. This is your donations, it's your daily, monthly, weekly, contributions, whatever it looks like for your organisation. We see it at the telly all the time from the big nationals, don't we? And it works, but actually that's about reach, and we'll talk about reach in a moment, an audience. And what I would say about all of these actually, and everything on this slide, if you start at the top of this slide, actually all of the funds at the top are pretty much about one-to-one relationships. And as you work your way down the slide, they start to be about one-to-many relationships. And that's really important. We'll think more about that in a minute. And then finally at the bottom, I'm going to talk about trading later, but actually your primary and secondary trading as an organisation. I think trading is an underused opportunity in most not-for-profits. Now there are different kinds of trading, both secondary and primary, but one that I think people forget about, but I've seen work really well, and you see the nationals do really well, membership. Look at the success of RSPB, for example. One of the things they did, I remember as a child, I was a member of their bird watchers club, whatever it was called at the time, and it was £20 a year or something like that. I got, you get your little certificates and access to the events. But actually, I bet they made a small fortune out of that year on year. So where that works for an organisation, really interesting opportunity. Richard, talk to us about digital for a minute, about Giving Machine, if you could.
Oh yeah, no, sure. So thank you. So I must admit, on this whole landscape, I must admit, I've tended to focus certainly with my colleagues in the sort of community fundraising bit, and it was kind of just an interesting story that I thought I would share. Was when we first started it, we thought, how can we give back? And it was a bunch of people who worked in the profit sector. What can we do to make a difference in the non-profit sectors? And we went to meet some of the larger brand charities, but it was very interesting because their view of donor segmentation and donor analysis was very much, well, actually, do you know what? It's going to be easier just to go to our whole donor base and ask them for an extra tenner and know that we're going to lose some people, but we'll make more money. And I get it, because that's very much looking at your, that's looking at customer base. But for me, that felt really icky. And I guess that's, you know, that's the reality of it. Whereas in community, you can't treat people like that because actually you know them. And I think that's probably why we've gravitated, and I did, towards the community, smaller organizations where typically you have that sort of relationship with your supporter base because they know each other. So, you know, if you look at primary schools, for example, with parents, you can't keep asking parents for more money because actually they talk to each other, they get pissed off, they haven't got more money. So we decided to play a role in that. So without it sounding like an advert, because I think that's the wrong place for in this webinar for that, that's what we focused on, providing free to use services. And in fact, in later years, we focused on the lottery. And interesting, a funny story about the lottery, we wanted to launch one of our own, went to a third party lottery platform. We got rejected because we aren't a direct impact charity. So then we thought, hey, that's interesting. Let's do our own and open the floodgates to let any organization that's trying to do good in. And that's kind of what we did. So we provide a lottery platform. But what we find is with the lotteries is you need to have a license, but we can help bypass that because we're a charity ourselves, and it can operate under ours. So that's where we tend to play. We also played in the shopping, the online shopping, and converting that to donations. But I would say over the last few years, it still works, but it doesn't work quite as well as it used to. Amazon decided to pull out of that side of things because they were doing their own, and then they decided to pull out of that as well. So actually, and we all know that a lot of things have moved towards Amazon. So I'd say the shopping stuff still works generically, but it's not as good as it used to be because shops don't have the same kind of margins, and a lot of us do shop at Amazon. So that's kind of just a very quick summary, I guess, of where we focus. But my passion personally is in those smaller organizations that have a disproportionate impact on our communities and often never get the limelight sort of, if you like, shone on them.
Thanks, Richard. Should we move on to the next slide?
Let's do that. So I've seen this risk sort of, you know, existing market, new market and stuff, obviously in a lot of the sort of business side of things, but you've obviously amended this for how does it work in fundraising?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is academic theory at its heart, but actually it's really interesting. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I just want to make the point, we've talked about risk. Now, if we're thinking about managing risk as a not-for-profit with our fundraising, there's two things we perhaps want to be thinking about fundamentally. Who are our donors and what strategy are we adopting? Now, when we're planning our fundraising, we need to be thinking, where are we safe? Well, we're safest in the top left-hand corner, an existing strategy with an existing donor. Yeah, so the same donors, the same products, the same platforms. That's comfortable territory, but it's probably not the territory for lots of growth. Yeah. The problem with this model is that the further we get to the bottom right, the bigger the opportunity for growth, but the bigger the risk gets. Yeah. So do we really want to be in that bottom right? New donors, new products, new platform. Everything's new. Everything's exciting. Everything's risky.
But yeah? That's where all the shiny stuff is, Andrew. It looks nice and shiny down there.
It does, but you know what? It's not a great place because unless you are super brave and it's a tiny part of your planning. And you know, we talked earlier about how much of your strategy, you know, your fundraising this is. If that's a tiny bit of it, you know what, a little bit of risk there, that's okay. If it's 75% of your fundraising, I'd be really worried. Yeah. So generally speaking, where you should be thinking about in most of your fundraising strategies, looking at new donors, existing products or platforms. So how do we get new people to take on the things we already do well? Yeah, from a fundraising perspective. Or how do we get our existing donors to engage with new kinds of fundraising? So can our individual givers be persuaded to run a marathon for us? Yeah. Or coming back to the pink one again, can we get new people to become individual giving donors?
And in fact, and on that, you could use existing donors to help get new donors. So moving sort of across or down is far lower risk.
Absolutely. So yeah, don't spend a lot of time on it, but it's really important. Beware of those shiny things, because whilst they look great, they come with a lot of risk, and don't change too many variables at any one time. Try and avoid moving diagonally across this diagram. That's really the key point.
And it's just, and what I would say, it sounds so obvious, right? But I've seen so many, it doesn't matter whether you're talking commercial leadership teams, it's just, you get overwhelmed by you've seen someone else do something, you think that's really good, we need to do that, and you kind of forget this. And it's just, but you can get there, but just take a couple of steps to move there. Absolutely.
Right, let's move on, Richard.
Okay, so avoiding a car crash. Now, obviously, this is metaphorical. So what are some of the things that would really help make sure that we avoid that that sort of car crash, the big mistakes?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a huge long list of things here. And of course, you know, no one does all of these, or even very many of them a lot of the time, but it's just be worth being aware of them. So things to think about. Make sure you haven't got unclear goals and you know what your outcomes are. Yeah. You know, are you testing the viability of the platform? Is it, you know, is this the big thing? Is it going to work? Don't throw all your eggs into that basket before you're dead confident that it's, you know, the basket's going to hold the weight of them. Yeah, it's going to deliver what you want. Have realistic expectations. Far too often I come across boards of trustees who effectively say to their fundraisers, oh, yeah, so this is what we need to spend this year, and that's the gap in the budget. So your job is to fill that gap, please. There's no measuring that of what's possible. It could be 3 times what they did last year. You know, that's a massive ask.
Yeah.
You know, so be aware of that. And then linked to that, insufficient investment. And these two things often go together, which is even more frightening. And that's where an organisation doesn't invest in fundraising because there's a risk, a real fear, a real risk aversion, but then they also have a massive expectation of their fundraising. Yeah, these two things don't go well together. If you're going to have a big expectation, you've got to accept that there's going to be a cost with that, and it's going to be risky. You know, it comes back to the earlier diagram, doesn't it? You know, we're getting into that bottom right-hand corner if we're not careful. Yeah. Over-reliance on one or more income streams, that worries me deeply, particularly grant and commissioning reliance are the two that frighten me the most, because they're the ones that are, you know, can evaporate on you. Whereas other things, at least are diversified. Individual giving, you know, if you have a good individual giving program, you have lots and lots and lots of people. So if you lose a few donors, it's not a complete disaster. You lose one really big grant, one really big commissioning source, you know, that could be terminal.
And in fact, Andrew, when you look at some of the people that you do the work with and they do the analysis of the organisation, isn't that one of the things they look at, is how reliant you are on grants? So how sort of sustainable you are on your own without sort of the big lumpy stuff?
Yeah, it depends on the source you look at, but it's certainly part of the analysis. It's certainly part of our analysis for clients as well, because it's so important that you have this diversified approach.
Yeah.
Other things to think about. So fundraisers who have little or no support from their board, that's a real problem. One of the in not-for-profits, I think, there's a cultural thing that really matters, and that's that everybody's a fundraiser. Fundraising is everybody's job. It's not just the poor fundraiser's job. They might be coordinating it, they might be managing it, but everybody has a place to play. You know, it's not for the board members to turn up, you know, once a quarter and, you know, just attend a meeting. They should be advocates for that charity, making introductions, helping those fundraisers be successful. They should be enablers, and that often doesn't happen. And it's the same across the whole organisation. Actually, everyone has a role, a place to play in the fundraising if they want the organisation to be successful. Failure to understand that is crucial. Impatience, rushing, poor preparation, fundraising in panic mode. That happens way too often. I get why, but equally it's a problem. The more panicky you get, the more difficult it gets, because you're putting ridiculous levels of pressure.
Yeah, I think on that, you know, I think even if you think as an individual, if you walk into a shop and someone's trying to desperately sell to you, it just comes across, and it just comes back to that. It takes a longer time, but the engagement should be much more sort of positive. And I think just to the point you were saying about the overall strategy, I know when I'm working with leadership teams in the sort of the commercial sector, you've still got to make sure everyone understands the core values of the business and what the business is about and its basic marketing strategy, because that's one of the things I teach in general is everyone's responsible for the success of the business. Everyone, not just the sales team or the operations team. And the charity is even more important because you've got a social impact to make. So in fact, actually making sure everyone understands how do we attract people in to help us do what we do.
It's really interesting, Richard. I did a radio interview last week, and one of the key messages in that is actually a really well-run charity looks an awful lot like a really well-run business. Yeah.
Well, it's funny because one of the things I'll often say is that the main difference in how you run it really is A minus B is either a profit or surplus, right? Because if you look at, yes, of course, there's tons more to it, but actually many profitable businesses are very social in their outlook of what they want to achieve, and many charities are very businesslike. So I think the more we can bring them together, it makes absolute sense.
Absolutely. So let's come back to this list of challenges that, because there's loads more actually, and I could go on all day about this actually. So let's think of other things that are real issues. They're having the right skills and experience or not having the big issue. Yeah, if you don't have that, you're going to struggle. Inadequate prospect and audience research. If you don't understand who you're talking to or want to talk to, how are you going to get your messaging right? So much of fundraising is marketing, actually, and we'll come on to that in a minute. Limited innovation, doing the same things every year because that's what we did. It just becomes a pattern. It gets boring and people disengage eventually, and that's a problem. There's got to be a little bit new and shiny in the blend. And I've seen some great ideas come out from people doing this stuff. Poor risk management, we've talked a lot about that, so I'm not going to go into a great deal of depth there. Competition, not standing out in what is a really crowded space. Now, understand the pool you're fishing in. Are we dealing with are we trying to compete with Save the Children and international fundraising, or are we actually trying to compete locally? And then think about that pool and how do we get our messaging out in the one that's relevant to us, and where do we have the scale to have impact? Yeah, there's no point for a little local charity trying to do regional fundraising. You need to be really good at doing stuff in your community, and so on. Yeah. Coming on again, audience development, poor visibility, poor PR and marketing, those promotional failures, not thinking about risks in the environment. Who could have predicted it? But look at the impact of COVID, look at the impact of cost of living. These things affect our world as fundraisers, so we need to at least have an awareness they may come along. Yeah. Not leveraging technology. How do we use CRM in our organizations? How do we use that? Really helps. How do we use social media effectively? Look at the digital platforms and tools that are available. There's more by the day. I try really hard to stay on top of this, and it's really difficult because it's forever changing. But there's some great people coming up with amazing ideas every day, and trying to stay on top of some of this stuff is well worth it. Yeah. Oh, someone's dropped out and come back in again.
And I think on that topic, Andrew, you don't necessarily always have to have all the skills in your organisation, but I think having access to them through either trustees, but also I think a network of advisors, because not everyone wants to the formal role of a trustee, but certainly digital advisors, which could be just someone who's really good at digital stuff, or a combination of them. You don't have to have them as necessarily the employees in the company.
And every business, every organisation not only has its formal connections, but it also has this network of friends, is how I like to think of them. They're just your network of contacts, and they can be incredibly powerful for you. That simple ask, do you know anything about this? And 20 minutes might make all the difference for you. So thinking about that, the other big issue we find quite often, people are afraid to make that face-to-face ask. Yeah, actually, particularly individual giving and corporate and legacy, one of the biggest barriers in those spaces is actually, can you help us? Being prepared to make that ask, and you just can't. It's really important. That sometimes requires some training and support for people to actually have the confidence there. It's sales skills at its heart, and this is where again these two areas come together in really unexpected ways, but they're so true. Poor storytelling is a big issue. You've got to be persuasive. You've got to create a connection. You've got to have emotional hooks, but you've also got to use hard evidence, because an emotional hook without evidence doesn't work. You need both. Yeah. And coming back to Richard's point earlier, over-reliance on fear rather than happiness. Yeah. Fear has a place in fundraising, but it comes with problems. Happiness is a much better way of approaching it if you can. Make someone feel good about their giving, and that's going to work for you. And then really towards the end of this list, failure to build lasting relationships. There's an expectation sometimes that, well, people give, we're a charity. Well, it doesn't work like that. Yeah. You need to follow up. You've got to have good donor stewardship. You've actually got to build relationships and maintain relationships, stay in touch with people and communicate. That ongoing relationship doesn't just happen. You've got to build it and put effort into it. And then find a couple of things, make sure you're compliant with the fundraising code. It's amazing how often we come across people who don't do that. And probably one of the most important things, learn first and pilot. Start small, think about minimum viable propositions. That's an IT term, really, it's hard, but it's a great idea. What's the smallest scale you can use to test something? Yeah. That's it definitely works. I did some work with the charity about selling Christmas cards a couple of years ago, and they only did a few hundred, but it was a really good experiment for them. And they learned a lot about how to make it work, but they also learned some massive logistical challenges that came with it for them. So it was great learning. And that's really everything under this category. Loads of stuff here.
Well, I think one of the things that I know when I'm working with some of the other leadership teams is having a culture where you can actually raise an issue and you can actually log. Do you know what? I think that's a problem, because it almost goes back to Darwinian evolution. It's not always getting it right first time, but it's your ability to evolve, which also means your ability to be honest about making mistakes, or actually where things didn't go quite to plan, and being open about that, and having trustees that support that. Because otherwise it becomes backside covering, and that doesn't help anyone. It's not transparent.
No, absolutely. Okay, Richard, should we move on the slide, please?
So, so obviously you touched on this earlier, which was really about the sort of an investment, I suppose, culture, if you like. And I thought that was an interesting stat. So, talk to us about that.
Yeah, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it's something I came across a while ago. Director of Social Change, really well-respected organisation in this space, and they have a great publication about fundraising strategy. And one of the things that really struck me when I first read it was that actually their advice is that a not-for-profit organisation should, on average, and obviously everybody's a little bit different, but they should be investing about 14% of their turnover in fundraising. That shows that actually fundraising doesn't just happen. To be successful, you've got to budget for it, you've got to plan for it. And if you don't, then actually, you've got no right really to turn around and think, actually, we're not doing very well here, are we? Because you've got to invest. However, and this is another really important point that goes with it, you've got to build up to that. There's no point in expecting your fundraising to go from zero to hero. It just doesn't happen. It takes time to build that momentum. Yeah, relationships take time, and so much of fundraising is relational in one form or another. Yeah, and then finally, and it's really the last point I want to make on this slide in a big way, is you need to think that your fundraising cost should only really be a net cost to your organisation, perhaps in the first year, maybe 18 months. Because as those relationships build, as momentum builds, your fundraising should cover its own costs and be a net benefit. If it's just costing you 14% and you're not seeing 20% back, that's a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But of course, that's just the sort of just the fundraising investment. I just think that whole culture of investment is really, really important, because I think one of the things that the sector has is this sort of idea that 100% of funds have to go to frontline delivery, which in my sort of, I suppose, my sort of startup and tech startup background is just saying, do you know what, we live in a very changing world now. It's changing faster than ever. So if everything was static, I could get that. But actually, we need to invest in our people. We need to invest in the technology. We need to invest in fundraising to balance the fact that we also need to be delivering and helping make a difference tomorrow as well as today. And I think that then leads to, what do you need on your board? You need good governance, but you also need some form of entrepreneurial spirit to say, we do need to evolve, right? And many organizations aren't fit for purpose. We see a lot of the organizations, just for-profit businesses, going out of business at the moment because the world's changed around them and their structure, their methodologies don't work anymore.
So, Richard, how do we get that risk-averse board to actually agree to invest then?
Well, I think first of all, I think it's the makeup of the board. You need a balance of, like any team, right? You need a balance of people that are willing to be sort of a bit more entrepreneurial and think, where could we go? What are some of that, where are the opportunities? But you also need the more risk averse people as well, because there's a good balance. It's like the yin and the yang, right? And between you can have a decent discussion. If you're only risk averse and governance focused, potentially you'll just dwindle and go out of business, which is not served. The needs often, when I meet these organizations, the needs they serve aren't going away. If anything, the needs are getting greater. So we need to think innovatively on how to solve the issues around us. And you know, as just because we're a charity does not mean to say we cannot be innovative. It really annoys me to think that we can be just as innovative as anyone else, and we need to think like that. But we do have a social purpose and a thread running through us of why we do what we do. So how do you do it? I think you need either advisors in your board. So one of the things might be is if you can't get on the board as a trustee, you can actually have guests in and say, do you know what, we want some innovation advisors to help us with our board governance. So we balance governance and innovation. And I would make sure that your board meeting has that as we have a governance section, and then we have a sort of strategic section.
Great advice. Really, really like that. Right, should we move on, Richard?
Yeah, let's do this.
So this very quick slide, this one, but just wanted to make the point really. Fundraising, marketing and sales are absolutely interrelated cousins, yeah, and they all stem from the idea of engagement. So what we have to do as a not-for-profit, actually as a business, yeah, we have to engage people first and foremost, and we do that through these three interrelated tools. And hopefully one of the themes you're getting as we're talking today is actually where these things connect. And that's really all I want to say here, beyond just one more point actually, and that's that when we're thinking about our fundraising, yeah, we've got to remember that some of our most successful fundraisers aren't actually fundraisers, they're advocates for us, yeah, and that advocacy can actually do more in terms of raising our profile that can lead to more opportunities, more fundraising than actually their individual value as a donor, yeah. So this is where these things are so important. You think about that triangle of skills and areas, and don't think about sales as a dirty word in a charity. Because so often that's the vibe I get from people, and it's a little wrong-headed, to be honest. So yeah,
thanks.
Richard, can we move on again? Is that okay?
Let's do this. So
right.
Attracting audiences.
Yeah. So this is really, really interesting. I've talked about some of this in brief, so I'm going to try and keep it fairly short. But only grants and commissioning don't require an audience. Yeah. Every other kind of fundraising I can think of is a numbers game. Yeah. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means we need to think that we've got the right audience for your cause. Yeah. So who already gives to us, and how can we create a lookalike for that? What kinds of people are like the people we're already engaged with? That might work for you. Who else might be persuaded to give? Why have they got a reason to give? Yeah. What's one of the phrases I use an awful lot when I'm talking to people is the "what's in it for me." Yeah. I think that's a huge universal human motivator. So you've got to understand what the "what's in it for me" from your audience is. What are they going to get from it, and how do you give it to them successfully? Yeah. Think about which generation group, which location, which interests. Those sort of characteristics could be part of the mix. Yeah. Who else cares about your why? Who else cares about what it is you're trying to do and why it matters? You've got to champion that why to attract an audience. If you don't do that, they're not going to have a reason to engage. They're not going to care. Yeah. And think about, a phrase that some of us involved in business network will be familiar with: know, like, and trust. Yeah. Do people trust enough to engage? Yeah. This is a really good model when you're thinking about audiences. How do they know you? Do they like you? And have you convinced them to trust you? If you can do those three things, then you've got a platform for giving.
And in fact, on that point, Andrew, standard marketing philosophy says you kind of sometimes have to hear at least 7 times before you've heard it. So actually that sort of no comes over repeated exposure to storytelling. So you can't just expect someone to go on that journey just like that. They have to hear from you several times to understand what on earth the issue is and how you're addressing it.
Absolutely. Richard, should we move on? Let's talk about marketing funnels, because it leads quite nicely.
Let's go through the marketing funnels.
Yeah. So this is an example I came up with a while ago, and it's based on crowdfunding, but the principle is universal. Okay. So we start at the bottom here for a minute. So if your goal, and this is a fairly typical goal for a smallish crowdfunder, is to raise about £10,000. Okay. I know that the average donation is £10 to £20. We'll use £10 for this particular example. Yeah. So if we need to get £10,000 in £10 donations, yeah, that's an awful lot of donations. Okay. I also know that typically 3 to 12% of the people who visit your crowdfunding page might make a donation. Yeah. So that leads me to knowing that we're going to need to see somewhere between 33 and 8,500 visitors to the page. Yeah, that's big numbers. The problem with that is people don't just land on your crowdfunding page. Okay, they have to be aware of your fundraising, or they're even going to visit the page. And there's a rate of attrition there. Yeah, not everybody who's aware of your crowdfunder is going to care enough to go visit the page. It's probably a similar percentage. And worse still than that, to be aware of your fundraiser, they have to be aware of you as an organisation. So again, there's a rate of attrition. Not everybody who's aware of you as an organisation is going to care about your fundraiser. And the percentages are probably broadly similar. So the simple truth of a marketing funnel is, and this is really the basic of this diagram, is that you have to pour an incredible volume of people in at the top through your social media, through paid advertising, through websites, through word of mouth, through everything you do. You need to have a massive marketing effort and a huge number of people who care to make your fundraising that isn't grants and isn't commissioning work. Because all of those other kinds of fundraising need a big audience, because you're only going to get a small drip out of the bottom. There's a huge rate of attrition. So the bigger we build the audience, the more you're building a stable platform that's capable for diversification. And that's really the point of this slide.
Yep, which is why it's very hard to build successful crowdfunders if you're a small organization, because you need such large audiences. Yeah,
certainly the likes of Brewdog, people talk about their £1 million crowdfunders. People forget that because these companies, corporate ones, they probably spent at least 10% of what they wanted to raise on marketing to get that audience. Yeah, at least 10%, if not more.
Yeah.
You know, that's how to raise £1 million, it's £100,000 investment. Usually to raise 10 grand, it's at least £1,000 to £2,000 investment.
Yeah.
So think about it in those terms. Building your audience is hard.
Okay.
Richard, should we move on?
Yeah. So I must admit, because of this was quite a wide-ranging webinar, I just put on this little bit about some of the digital, how to make sense of it all. And I'm actually going to start at the very bottom, which is you've got to keep evolving, but you've got to keep it simple because it's such a massive landscape. So I think that the bullet points I really felt were very important. And when I work with for-profit or non-profit organizations, be very clear on your vision and plan. And there's a really great template that I use with most businesses, just a 2-pager, but basically be very clear of your why, because that sets the tone for everything with the business. Then, of course, you've got to set out your stall, your storytelling and your content plan, but keep it really simple. But make sure your why comes across. Why is what you're doing really important? And tell some of the stories of some of the things that you're doing to make a difference. I always think of David Attenborough like that. He's always telling a story. You don't actually get all just facts. You actually get a story telling to do with some of the animals we talk about. Website optimized just means make sure it's doing the job you want it to do. Does it tell the stories very simply, and does it funnel people into the calls to action you want, whether it's donate, sign up to your newsletter, whatever? Because sometimes we chuck everything in there and it's just a complete dog's breakfast. So just make sure you get some advice to make sure, keep it simple. It doesn't have to be super complicated, but just making sure that people find what they're looking for really quickly. The audience attraction and engagement really is just understand who your audiences are and keep it simple. Is it social media, email? Use some of the fundraising platforms and tools that are out there, depending on what is useful to you, but just don't necessarily use everything. Just pick and choose the ones that make sense for you, and be clear that you can use paid and organic advertising. If you're a registered charity, you can get Google ads. Be aware that you can do that, and also be aware loads of people say they know how to do Google ads, but actually a lot of them don't. So, you know, if you want recommendations, put that into the chat on CCN and ask, do people know how to leverage that, and can they recommend people? Because it's a nice way of leveraging some free stuff from Google. Management, measurement and monitoring. This was just make sure anything you do, you've got some sense of how do you know it's working on a repetitive basis. And if you sub it out to someone else, how do you know they're working? How do you know it's doing what you want it to do? It doesn't have to be overcomplicated, but the biggest failure is just not measuring. So fundraising CRM is a question, do you need one? You may not need one, but if you do, find one that works for you. And look at, there's loads of articles about which ones are particularly useful. I've talked about metrics and analytics, but you should be measuring the basics on everything. And really look at ongoing training and education for yourself. And there's plenty of free courses out there, whether it's for your trustees, whether it's for you. Just invest in yourself, because if you don't know some of these things, you're not going to be able to leverage it. But I think going back, and I'll come back to the last point, was you need to keep evolving, but just always look to simplify, because this, otherwise it feels like a complete complex world, and it doesn't have to be. And ask for help. Again, that's what the CCN's there for. I think that's probably all I wanted to say on digital for now.
Brilliant, Richard. Well, in which case, let's move on and talk a little bit about primary and secondary trading. Now, this is the last of our kind of content slides. You'll be glad to know we've overrun a little bit, but hopefully you've had enough value to make it worth that little bit extra of your time than we planned. What I want to say here is that trading is really important, and I think it's underused, but it's complicated. There's no two ways about it, particularly for charities. If you're a social enterprise, this is easy space. Thank you, Mazan. So let's just talk about trading for a moment. So understand what they are. So there's three issues from trading: primary, ancillary, and secondary trading. Primary trading, this is effectively things like selling tickets if you're a charitable theatre. It's the stuff that you do to deliver your purpose, your core activity. Yeah. So if you can trade and make some money by selling that service in some way, that's primary trading. That's really quite straightforward from a charity perspective. Ancillary trading, so this is associated with your primary activity. So for example, the one I quite like this example, that same charitable theatre, they could sell food and drink to their audience, yeah, and that would be ancillary to their primary activity. Again, not a problem. It's secondary trading where it gets more complicated. Secondary trading, yeah, this is unrelated to how you deliver your cause. Yeah, it's just about fundraising. So an example would be if that same charitable theatre who run a cafe, because we know they run a cafe because they serve drinks to their audience, yeah, if they then opened that cafe to the general public as a cafe, that would have no direct relationship to their core activity, and as a result could potentially be risky because it becomes secondary trading. Mm-hmm. Now, the thing about secondary trading that you've got to think about is it's about risk. Yeah, the Charity Commission have a real issue with secondary trading where it's considered to be risky. If it's liable to lead to a loss, then they will have a real issue with it. So that's the key. So when we're thinking about secondary, or actually any kinds of subsidiary or non-primary trading activity where there could be a significant risk, you've got to think about how do we manage that? Yeah, are we going to lose money? And in which case you might then want to think about some kind of trading subsidiary as a solution. That could be a social enterprise, it could be a company limited by guarantee, whatever. But the kinds of activity that organisations often go into, and this can be very successful, charity shops. We know general charity shops, furniture. I was talking to a chap yesterday running a charity down in Milton Keynes. They have a beekeeping project that makes money. They have a food box project that makes money. They have a cycle recycling project that makes money. Yeah, but all of these have social benefits as well. It's really quite clever. And then you've got other things, online shops. Can you leverage technology, eBay, Amazon, those sorts of things? If they work in the business world, they can work for charities just as successfully, actually, if designed well. Can you think about membership? Is there opportunity for some kind of membership-based service that is perhaps added value in some way? What other fee-paying activities could work in your space? Could you be selling skills and training? That's quite a common one for charities. Sharing your skills to third parties and providing training at a commercial rate. These are things that are quite interesting. But often, if you're going to go down this space and if there's a risk of loss, then you have to think about how do I structure it as a charity, particularly if it's going to be in that secondary trading activity, i.e. things that aren't about delivering your core day-to-day service purpose. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. Richard?
Yep.
Really complicated issue, that one.
No, I know it's something that I've looked into in the past as well. Now, given the time, I was thinking we probably ought to sort of wrap up a little bit and say, please do share your experience on the CCN group. Any information you have that's helpful to others, please do share that. And obviously, if you've got further questions on any of the information that's been shared, these are our details, but you can also contact us through the CCN network on LinkedIn. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to share at all, Andrew?
No, I think that's everything. What we will do, we will share these slides and the recording into the CCN group in the next day or two. So that'll be available for people if they want to follow it up. I'm certainly happy to chat to people. I know Richard probably is as well. So reach out and get in touch. And if you've got a few minutes now and you've got a question, I'm happy to hang around for a few minutes and try and answer one or two.
Yep, sure. And yeah, I popped a question in the chat just to check that the chat works. If there's any there. So I mean, I've got a question for you, Andrew. If you wanted to kick off starting up your own sort of charity shop, because obviously generally it's dominated by the hospices and certain specific charities. You know, how do you go about thinking about how that could work for you in your local neighbourhood?
Well, there's lots of questions in. Charity shops are quite complicated. But do you have the volunteer resource to run it? Be one of my questions. And then, you know, sites. One of the things that makes charity shops work or not work is actually, you know, ground rents and, you know, can you get a space that's going to work for it? So actually, often it's starting with an opportunity. So actually, is there somebody? Is there a local building? Is there a local shopping centre that's full of vacant units where you can do a deal to take one of these units over, even on a fairly short-term basis?
Yeah.
You know, perhaps do a pop-up shop, test the idea for you know, a few months, see if that can be made to work. Because, you know, the problem with charity shops, of course, it relies on donation again. So you've got to have this massive audience who are prepared to know you want the stuff, know what you want, and prepared to drop it in. And then you've got to think, how am I going to process it? So that's where the manpower comes into this. Yeah. You know, there's no point in just getting, you know, filling a room with black plastic bags and hoping someone will buy it. It's not going to happen.
No. But and in terms of legal structure, do you need to set up a trading subsidiary to do that?
So it depends on that question of risk. Not necessarily. Yeah. I think in most cases that there will be a trading subsidiary in place. And it's because if you're then paying staff or you're having to pay some ground rent, those sorts of things. So this is why I think probably starting with the pop-up shop approach, trying to get a donation of a unit for perhaps 6 months or something like that to try it. So you might start that way within the charity, see if you've tested the water, minimise your risk by the way you've approached it. And then if that looks like it's going to be successful, then you perhaps take the step at that point. The trouble is creating a subsidiary, it does massively create, you know, additional admin and things like that.
Well,
so
absolutely. Yeah.
You know, don't jump in feet first, I think is the advice.
Well, and I think one of the things we said earlier was, you know, start small, keep, you know, do a test to make sure that you think it could work.
Exactly that.
Well, I don't think I can't see any other questions in the chat.
No.
So I think we're probably about there.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I've really enjoyed it, and thank you for coming along, folks. Hopefully you've got some value, and please feel free to get in touch with us at a later date.
Right.
Thanks
Take
very much,
care.
Richard.
Have a good day. Cheers, Andrew. Bye-bye.